Okay, so you know how we like to really get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on in India, right?
Hmm.
And especially for those of you out there who are, deep in the world of UPSC and really want to understand the nuances of how things work and maybe even, ace those exams coming up.
Absolutely.
We're doing a deep dive today on something pretty fundamental to India's development and its future, and that's the whole idea of health for all.
Yeah, health for all. Big commitment, right?
Big commitment, huge. And we're going to be specifically looking at how India is approaching universal health coverage.
Yeah.
The strategies they're using, the successes, the challenges, the whole nine yards.
Exactly. We've been poring over a ton of material on India's health policies, and particularly how they're trying to make this UHC thing a reality, the whole World Health Organization framework.
Right.
And of course, we have to talk about AB-PMJAY, AYAI. That's the Ayushman Bharat Pradhan Mantri Arogya Yojana.
Yeah, that's a mouthful,
It is, but it's a major player in this whole scene.
for sure. So what we really want to do today is sort of equip you with the knowledge to answer the question, are India's current strategies actually going to get them to this health for all goal?
Yeah.
Is it working? Is it comprehensive? Is it equitable? Because honestly, that's the kind of critical thinking that the UPSC examiners are looking for, right? Not just the facts, but the analysis.
Absolutely. Spot on. And this isn't just about the mains exam either. Understanding these dynamics can be incredibly valuable for the prelims too, those tricky multiple choice questions.
Oh, for sure,
Yeah.
for sure. So one thing that really jumps out at us when we look at this whole picture is the way India's approach to healthcare has kind of shifted in recent years.
Yeah.
We used to see a big emphasis on building up this solid base of primary healthcare, right?
Right.
But now it seems like the focus is moving more towards insurance-based models.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant shift, and it definitely has implications for how healthcare is delivered and accessed across the country.
Exactly. So let's unpack this a bit more. First off, India's commitment to health for all. This isn't exactly a new idea, is it? It's been part of the WHO's UHC framework for quite a while.
Oh, yeah. This has been a long-standing principle in global health, and India's been on board with it for decades. It's actually deeply embedded in a lot of their early health planning documents.
So what was the initial thinking? Like, what was the main strategy for achieving health for all back in the day?
Well, the real emphasis, both globally and within India, was on establishing a strong foundation of primary health care.
Okay.
The idea was if you make primary care accessible and effective, you can catch health issues early on,
Yeah.
right? Do more in terms of preventing disease and ultimately reduce the amount of money people have to pay out of their own pockets for medical expenses.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's all about reducing that financial burden, which we call out-of-pocket expenditure, or OPO.
Right. Oop. Got it. So it sounds like a pretty logical approach. Deal with health problems when they're small, keep people healthy in the first place, and avoid those situations where people are hit with huge medical bills that they just can't afford.
Exactly. It's kind of like preventative maintenance for your health, right?
Yeah.
Cheaper and easier to fix things before they become major problems.
So then where does AB-PMJAY fit into all of this? What was the thinking behind shifting towards this insurance-based model?
Okay, so AB-PMJAY, it's a huge policy initiative, and the main aim is to reduce those out-of-pocket expenses we were talking about.
Okay.
It works by providing insurance coverage to a large chunk of the population. But, and this is a big, but it's mainly focused on covering the costs of hospital treatments.
So it's like a safety net for if you get really sick and need to be hospitalized.
Exactly. It's trying to protect people from those really high costs that can come with being in the hospital for a while.
I see. And I think this is where things get interesting. The source we're looking at today suggests that this heavy focus on insurance for hospital stays might actually be taking away resources and attention from that initial goal of strengthening primary health care.
Yeah, that's the key point here. It's like we're putting all our eggs in the hospital basket and kind of neglecting the foundation of a healthy population.
And that foundation is primary care.
Precisely.
And that's what ultimately prevents those expensive hospital visits in the first place.
Exactly.
So this brings up a really important question. Why is a good primary healthcare system so crucial? Like, what's the big deal?
Okay, think of it this way. A strong PHC system is like the front line of defense when it comes to public health.
Okay.
It's where people go when they first start feeling sick. It's where they
Right.
get those routine checkups and screenings. It's where they learn about healthy habits and get vaccinated.
Right.
And it's all happening at a local level, so it's convenient and it's hopefully affordable too.
So if we're talking about early detection and prevention, a strong PHC system is key.
Absolutely. If PHC is working well, fewer people end up needing to go to the hospital for things that could have been managed much earlier on in the community.
Makes sense. So how does AB-PMJAY specifically weaken the primary healthcare infrastructure?
Hmm.
Like, how does that actually play out on the ground?
Well, if you're channeling a lot of funding and attention towards hospitals so you can reimburse those insurance claims, it can mean that less money and less focus goes towards things like, building up those primary health centers, training community health workers, running those important preventative programs.
Right.
And this trend actually goes against the recommendations of a really important committee, the Bohr Committee, which way back in the day envisioned a healthcare system that looked like a pyramid.
A pyramid?
Yeah, with a broad, strong base of primary healthcare supporting everything else above it.
Ah, so we're kind of flipping the pyramid on its head.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And that can have consequences.
So what are the consequences? Like,
Yeah.
what happens when primary healthcare isn't strong enough?
Well, if people don't have access to good primary care, they often wait until they're really sick before seeking help, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that means they're more likely to need those expensive specialized treatments that hospitals provide.
Right.
So what happens? Hospitals get overcrowded. People end up waiting longer for care and conditions that could have been easily managed at a primary health center turn into big, expensive problems.
But also it's like a domino effect.
Exactly. And remember what we said before. Prevention is almost always cheaper and more effective in the long run.
So it's kind of a paradox, isn't it? We're trying to reduce out-of-pocket expenses by providing insurance, but by focusing so much on hospitals, we might actually be driving up healthcare costs in the long run.
That's a really important point to consider. And it gets even more complicated when you start thinking about all the expenses that AB-PMJAY doesn't actually cover.
Like what?
Okay, so let's say someone has AB-PMJAY and they need to be hospitalized. That's great. The scheme will likely cover a big portion of the hospital bill. But what about all the other costs involved in getting health care? Things like consultations with doctors, diagnostic tests, medications.
Oh, right. All that stuff adds up.
It really does. And for a lot of people, especially those with lower incomes, those expenses can be a huge financial burden.
So even with insurance, they're still left with a lot of out-of-pocket costs.
Exactly. And here's another thing to think about. The way the scheme is structured might actually discourage people from seeking medical advice early on.
How so?
Well, if people think they'll only get coverage if they're sick enough to be hospitalized, they might put off going to the doctor until it's absolutely necessary.
Ah, I see.
And then, of course, they're more likely to need those more expensive hospital treatments.
So it's like a vicious cycle.
It can be. And then on the flip side, there's the potential for private hospitals to see this increased demand from insured patients. And,
Yeah.
well, let's just say there's an incentive for them to maybe inflate their charges a bit for procedures and even for basic things. So who ends up paying the price? The patients do either directly through those uncovered charges or through higher insurance premiums down the line.
It's complicated.
It is. And we can't forget about all those post-hospitalization costs, too, like the medications you need after your discharge, follow-up appointments, more tests.
Right. All those things add to the out-of-pocket expenses.
Exactly. It's a complex picture. And this brings us to another big trend. We're seeing the rise of private healthcare in India.
Yeah, it seems like AB-PMJAY has really fueled this expansion, hasn't it?
It's definitely been a major driver. The increased demand for hospital services has created a lot of opportunities for private healthcare providers to step in and fill the gap.
And is that necessarily a bad thing?
Well, it's not so simple. There are pros and cons to consider. On the one hand, having more private healthcare options can increase access to care, especially in areas where public healthcare services are limited. But on the other hand, there's a risk that this shift towards privatization comes at the expense of strengthening our public healthcare system, especially those primary health centers we were talking about.
So it's like a balancing act.
It is. And we need to be mindful of the potential downsides of relying too heavily on a market-driven private healthcare system.
Like, what are some of those downsides?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that private hospitals are businesses, right?
Right.
And businesses are driven by profit.
Makes sense.
So there's always a temptation to overcharge for services or even recommend unnecessary treatments just to maximize those insurance claims.
Right.
And another issue is that private hospitals tend to be concentrated in urban areas, which means that people in rural communities often have to travel long distances to access care, and that can be a huge barrier.
especially for people who are already struggling financially.
Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about the challenges and the potential unintended consequences of this shift towards insurance-based healthcare.
Yeah.
But what about the people who are supposed to be benefiting from this system?
Right.
The source we're looking at today highlights the difficulties that a lot of Indians face when it comes to actually accessing these schemes,
Yeah.
especially India's massive informal workforce.
Yeah, this is a really crucial point that often gets overlooked. India has a huge number of people working in the informal sector, migrant laborers, daily wage earners, people in the gig economy.
Hmm.
And for a lot of them, accessing insurance schemes like AB-PMJAY is a real struggle.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, they often lack the formal documentation that's needed to enroll in these programs, things like proof of address, employment records, that kind of stuff.
So the system is kind of set up for people who are already integrated into the formal economy.
In a way, yeah. And then there's the whole issue of the enrollment process itself. It can be pretty complex, and it often relies on technology and digital platforms, which can be a barrier for people who aren't tech savvy or who don't have regular access to the internet.
Right.
And on top of that, there's a lack of awareness. A lot of people in the informal sector just don't know about these schemes or how to access them.
So they're kind of left out of the system.
Yeah, and that makes them vulnerable to exploitation by middlemen who might charge them fees to help them enroll or to access healthcare services.
So it's not just about the scheme itself, it's about all the surrounding factors that can make it difficult for people to actually benefit from it.
Exactly. And this is especially concerning when you consider that the scheme mainly focuses on covering individual hospitalization.
Right.
So if you're a family with young children or someone with a chronic illness that requires ongoing care, this type of coverage might not be enough.
It's addressing one specific need, but not the broader spectrum of healthcare needs that families, especially vulnerable families, have to deal with.
Exactly. And those preventative services that we were talking about earlier, those are so important for keeping people healthy and preventing those expensive hospital visits down the line.
Right.
But they're often not adequately covered by a scheme that's primarily focused on hospitalization.
So where is the money actually going? What does the 2025 health budget tell us about the government's priorities?
Well, one of the big takeaways from the budget is that there's a continued emphasis on expanding digital medical infrastructure.
Okay.
Things like telemedicine, electronic health records, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And there's also a lot of funding being allocated to building new medical colleges and training more healthcare professionals.
Which is important long term.
It is. But when you look at the numbers, the allocation for strengthening primary healthcare at the grassroots level seems comparatively low.
So it's like we're investing in the future, but maybe neglecting the present.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And for you as someone who's tracking these policy shifts, it's important to pay attention to how these budgetary decisions reflect the government's overall approach to healthcare.
And what about that recent move to allow 100% foreign direct investment in the insurance sector? What's the thinking behind that, and what could it mean for healthcare in India?
Okay, so the government's argument is that by opening up the insurance sector to more foreign investment, they're going to increase competition. And that should lead to more people having access to health insurance, especially in rural areas where coverage is often limited.
Okay.
But, more insurance doesn't automatically translate to better healthcare. It really depends on how this increased private sector involvement is managed and regulated.
Right, because if the quality of care doesn't improve or if costs keep going up, then what's the point?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have strong regulations in place to prevent things like price gouging and to ensure that people are actually getting the care they need.
And what about those vulnerable groups we were talking about earlier? Will they really benefit from this increased focus on insurance?
Oh, that's a big question. Insurance can be complex, and for people who are already struggling to navigate the healthcare system, it can be really challenging to understand all the fine print and to make sure they're getting the coverage they need.
So it's not just about having insurance. It's about having access to information and support to help people understand and use it effectively.
Exactly. And if that doesn't happen, there's a real risk that this shift towards privatization could actually exacerbate existing inequalities in the healthcare system.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. And it's always helpful to look at what other countries have done when it comes to healthcare to see what lessons we can learn.
So what are some examples of countries that have done well in terms of providing universal health care?
Well, one country that often gets praised for its healthcare system is Thailand.
Okay.
They've managed to achieve almost universal health coverage by relying mainly on general tax revenue and by making big public investments in their healthcare system.
So it's a very different approach from the U.S. system, which is heavily reliant on private insurance.
Very different, and the results speak for themselves. Thailand has much lower healthcare costs than the US, and they've been very successful in reducing out-of-pocket expenses for their citizens.
Interesting. So what's the key takeaway here? Like, what can India learn from Thailand's experience?
Well, I think the main lesson is that you don't necessarily need a system that's dominated by private insurance to achieve universal healthcare.
Okay.
It's possible to create a system that's publicly funded and that provides affordable, accessible care to everyone.
And Costa Rica is another good example, right?
Exactly. Costa Rica has also done a great job of prioritizing primary health care and providing universal coverage through a combination of public funding and regulated private insurance.
So there are models out there that India can look to for inspiration as they continue to grapple with this challenge of providing health for all.
Absolutely. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but there are definitely lessons to be learned from countries that have successfully implemented universal healthcare systems.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key policy recommendations that emerge from all of this? And what are the concrete steps that India could take to build a more sustainable and equitable healthcare system that truly lives up to the promise of health for all?
Okay, so a few things really stand out. First off, we need a significant boost in public investment, specifically targeted at strengthening primary health care. That means expanding the network of primary health centers, making sure they're adequately staffed and equipped, and putting a real emphasis on preventive and community-based services.
So back to the basics.
In a way, yeah. It's about recognizing that primary health care is the foundation of a healthy population and investing accordingly.
Makes sense. What else?
The second big thing is we need much stronger regulation of the private insurance sector.
Okay.
We have to prevent medical costs from spiraling out of control, and we need to make sure that private insurance companies are operating fairly and transparently.
So it's not about eliminating private insurance. It's about making sure it works for everyone, not just the companies.
Exactly. And the third key recommendation is to really focus on expanding public health care benefits to cover those vulnerable groups we talked about earlier. You know, the informal workers, the migrant populations, the unemployed. We need to make sure that everyone has genuine access to comprehensive health care, not just coverage for hospitalization.
So it's about addressing those systemic inequalities that prevent people from getting the care they need.
Exactly. And finally, we can't forget about the importance of data presence. Data is essential for making informed policy decisions and for ensuring that resources are being allocated effectively.
So we need better data collection and analysis to really understand the evolving healthcare needs of the population.
Exactly. We need to know where the gaps are and who's being left behind.
So it all comes down to striking that balance, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How do we harness the potential benefits of insurance-based models like AB-PMJAY while also making sure that we have a strong and accessible public healthcare system, particularly at that primary care level?
Exactly. That's the million-dollar question. And finding that balance is going to be crucial for India's success in achieving health for all.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into a really crucial issue for India. And for those of you listening who are prepping for the UPSC exams, I hope this has given you a much clearer understanding of just how complex this whole health for all challenge really is. It's not just about slogans and policies. It's about people and access and equity.
Absolutely.
And it's about recognizing that there's no easy fix.
Right.
It's going to take a multifaceted approach and a commitment to long-term solutions.
I completely agree.
So, as you continue to follow current events and deepen your understanding of these issues, I want to leave you with this question. How can India best integrate insurance mechanisms with a robust public health system to truly achieve that goal of universal and equitable healthcare? It's a question that's worth pondering. And if you found this deep dive valuable and relevant to your UPSC preparation, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses of important topics. And as always, we encourage you to share your thoughts and questions in the comments below. We want to hear from you. And just a quick reminder, the information we've discussed today is based on analysis from the Hindu. So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for that deeper understanding. See you next time.